undergraduate degree, a bachelor's degree, you know. So we want to look at the relationship between these variables, which makes it a quantitative question, right? We're going to apply a quantitative methodology to this question. There's no room here for, qualitative research. I mean, there's no need for it, right? That's not going to help us answer the question. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about research questions and variables and things later, so if you're not getting that now, we'll get to that in a little bit. So if your research question can go in several different directions, and maybe it's quantitative, and maybe I can fit in qualitative and all this other stuff, then it's probably not a very clear question to begin with. You're probably trying to do way too much with your research, and that's going to get really overwhelming. You shouldn't try to pursue just every direction all at once. It's way too much work to do, and your study will just never end. The best thing to do in that case is just revise your question so you're very clear on what it is that you're actually asking, what it is you're actually trying to find out. So keep in mind, this particular study on second career students isn't going to be the only study ever done on second career students. Nobody ever sets out with this idea of, I'm going to do a study and it's going to answer every question anybody could have on the topic for all time, right? That's just way too much to take on, and it's going to be terribly overwhelming. Instead, researchers tend to focus on a very narrow and specific research question that they're trying to answer, and the study is designed to answer that question. And then once it's over, another question comes up and another study is done, and so on and so on. People build entire careers studying just very few topics, and variations on those topics, several questions around a specific topic. So in our example, with the second career students versus traditional students, it's a quantitative research question, which means we're going to have a quantitative research design. We're going to figure out a rigorous way to collect our data, including sort of a way to process all of the data or analyze it. Then we're going to put all of our plans into motion, and go out and actually do the research, collect all of the information and process it. And finally, we, write everything up, and try and get it published in a journal or something. So on the face of it, it's a fairly straightforward process. But there's no room for best of both worlds, It's all of it flows fairly naturally from the question. So what often happens, and this is not, necessarily the way that it's intended to happen, but what often happens in mixed methods research, especially when you use this best of both worlds rationale, is one of two things, really. Either they're basically two separate studies guided by two separate research questions, which may or may not be kind of related, but basically you're doing two separate studies. Or you end up with one study where you have mostly, one methodology being used, and then the other is sort of thrown in there superficially as sort of this fluff method. And neither of those is, a proper mixed method study. So with our second career student example, right, pretty straightforward. Basically I would look at graduation percentages or graduation rates and see who graduates and who drops out, and then compare those numbers. That's a really, really simple kind of example, right? Now, if I was doing this best of both worlds, rationale, I might add an open-ended survey to look at motivation. Well, first of all, motivation for graduating is a different thing than I was initially planning to study, right? It's not graduation rates, it's motivation. That's two different things. And then secondly, using an open-ended study for qualitative research, as we'll find out later, is a really bad idea. It's just not the way to collect qualitative data. But sometimes that's what will happen in mixed methods research, is they put a few open-ended questions to their participants, and all of a sudden they think they're doing qualitative research. It's not. As I was saying earlier, I'm not opposed to mixed methods in general. There's nothing wrong with mixed methods. What I'm opposed to is this idea of the best of both worlds rationale and just kind of mashing them together in a way that's not so rigorous. Mixed methods can produce some pretty quality research as long as the methodology is justified by the research question. So let's change our research question to something that would be more appropriate for a mixed method study. Let's say that we're, instead of looking at graduation rates between second career and traditional students, Maybe we're looking at how the professional identity development influences the motivation to graduate in second career students and in traditional students, and sort of juxtaposing those. Obviously, that's not as simple. I mean, it's a far more complex question that's going to require us to use mixed methods. Can't be answered by just quantitative research or qualitative research alone. We need to actually combine them. So in this case, I'd probably track the students over their degrees, doing sort of assessments on professional identity at regular intervals and motivation at regular intervals. And then I'd probably also do like in-depth interviews to find out how they're experiencing the program, how they understand professional identity, and what their motivation is to graduate. So I'd have numeric information that would support the qualitative data, and I'd have qualitative information or qualitative data that would support the quantitative conclusions and things. And so they would really work together to answer my research question. And that could be a very interesting study. But I think it's clear that it's also far, far more work than just doing like a quantitative or qualitative study on its own. And as a researcher, I would need to figure out how all these pieces combine in a sort of unified way, which I wouldn't have to do if it was just collecting numeric data or qualitative data. So I have one final thing I'm going to say about the mixed methods, then I'll stop complaining about them for a little while. In order to do a good mixed method study, you need to have a good understanding of both quantitative and qualitative research. And remember I said like people are naturally drawn to one or the other. For mixed methods, you need to be strong in both. You can't just jump into a mixed method study if you're weak in one or the other approach. In fact, usually what happens with mixed method studies is they're not done by an individual person, but they're done by teams or groups of researchers. And each of them sort of bring their own specific talents to the project. My advice for those of you who are new to research and just learning about it for the first time is to focus on learning about quantitative and qualitative separately before you try to mix them together. I mean, if you don't understand them, then you're not going to be able to do a mixed method study anyway. Okay, so moving on, we're going to look at variables. Now these are the basic building blocks of quantitative research. There's no such thing as a qualitative variable. Qualitative research doesn't use variables, so this is just quantitative research. And the most basic variables that are in a quantitative study are the independent variable and the dependent variable, and a lot of students get those confused. The way that I remember it is that the dependent variable depends on the independent variable.
I was following the pack, all swallowed in their coats, with scarves of red tied round their throats, to keep their little heads from falling in the snow, and I turned around and there you go.
For me, that helps me remember that the dependent variable is the one that we observe, and the independent variable is the one that's manipulated. Another way you can remember it is the acronym ID or ID, if you're Freudian, or else, the thing that you show to get into the bar at night. So the most basic research study that you can do in quantitative research is looking at the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable, the IV and the DV. So basically what you're asking is, as the changes are observed in the IV, as the IV fluctuates, what's going on with the DV, dependent variable, right? So for example, if students spend more time studying, right, the independent variable, right, what happens to their grades? That's the dependent variable. But very often our world, it doesn't break down into these really direct connections between the independent variable and dependent variable, right? These direct relationships. There might be some sort of variable that comes in between them. These are called the mediating variables because they mediate or come between, the independent and the dependent variable. So what you'll see is that there are changes in the IV, the independent variable, that produce changes in the mediating variable, which in turn lead to changes in the dependent variable. So it's more of a chain of, or a sequence of cause and effect. So to give you an example of that, when students study more, that was our original independent variable, right? They feel more confident. That's our mediating variable, and it's the confidence, that directly produces the better test performance, not necessarily the time spent studying. So maybe that's our hypothesis that we're going to want to test. So then finally, we have a moderating variable. Moderating variable is a little bit different from the mediating variable because it's not necessarily in between the variables, but it still affects the relationship between the variable. The presence or absence of the moderating variable can change the intensity of a relationship or whether or not it even happens at all, So in our previous example, we were saying that studying boosted the confidence in taking a test, which in turn resulted in higher test scores. But we might notice that the confidence is only boosted in those students who are already doing well in the class, and those that aren't doing well, doesn't matter how much they study, they still perform poorly, right? So the confidence then would be a moderating variable because it moderates the relationship between the independent variable, the studying, and the mediating variable, which is confidence. Apart from the independent and dependent variables, there are also different types of variable. So quantitative variables are variables that vary by degree. So anything that you can kind of measure on like a numeric scale, sort of like weight, age, 1, 2, 3, 4. Temperature is another one. Those are quantitative variables, or sometimes they're called numeric variables or continuous variables because they're, a continuum of numbers. Also, there are categorical variables which vary by type, so they don't necessarily have a numeric value to them. So something like city, or what city you're from, or color, gender, right? Those are categorical variables. There are different types. There's men and women, right? You might be from Chicago or Toronto or Miami or some other place, right? Now, what you need to keep in mind is that even though categorical variables are not numeric or continuous, quantitative researchers are still counting, right? That's what makes it quantitative research. Car color might be a categorical variable. You have blue, black, red, right? But you still count. I've got 6 blue cars and 3 black cars and 4 red cars. So those are the two different kinds of variables, right? And we're going to break it down into a little bit further.